Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Reggie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks. That's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Has Jordan. Allen shakes free. Gets two!
Gilmore on
Stop! Brother.
lead. Toledo artists, you get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Berry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello, and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I'm your host, Jason Mann. With me today, he is the editor-in-chief of Hardwood Paroxysm, also the host of the R Squared podcast, which you can find on this very podcast network, Ian Levy. Welcome back, sir.
Thanks for having me on again.
So we are continuing our series talking about the top 50 players, now talking about modern players who could be contenders for that slot, and you've chosen Reggie Miller. He is 17th all-time in win shares, 45th all-time in win shares per 48, 49th in box score plus minus, 20th in value over replacement player, had 3 All-NBA third-team selections, 5 times was in the top 10 in the league in win shares, and once was top 10 in value over replacement player. We've been looking at some of the other all-time rankings for players. In the Bill Simmons pyramid, he is 63rd out of 98 players, and in the Slam 500, he is 54th. So, Ian, what do you think of Reggie Miller's top 50 case?
Well, I think it's probably less about stats than more it is about sort of his personality and his presence on the court. I grew up as a Pacers fan, and I kind of my interest in basketball sort of coincided with him entering his prime with the Pacers. So he was always my favorite player. He was always the player I watched the most closely, and even rooting for him strongly, even being a huge fan, I always sort of knew he was not the best shooting guard in the league. I don't think he was ever the best shooting guard in the league. I don't think he was ever, really an MVP candidate or anything like that. And I know that those sort of criteria are really big for these kind of conversations of lasting greatness. But he was, his presence on the court was so visceral. When you watched him play, he was just constantly in motion. Everything was moving around the court, and he was one of those guys who commanded defensive attention from all 5 of the opposing players because he was constantly running off screens, constantly, darting in and out, ducking behind players, and everybody had to pay attention to him. So his presence was really large. And then he has a well-deserved reputation as one of the best clutch players in the game. And he had all those memorable moments against the Knicks, hit a couple big shots against Jordan and the Bulls. And that kind of presence, that swagger, he believed in himself. Yeah, even if we all knew that he wasn't the best shooting guard in the game, or maybe even always the best player on the floor, he believed that he was, and he thought every shot was going to go in. And so on some level, that sort of belief and presence, I think, counts for something.
Yeah, and he was very, very good for such a long time. Like, that really has added up for him.
Yeah, that's another thing too. He was one of those players who maybe didn't peak as high as maybe some of the other players we're talking about, but his prime was not as high, but his prime lasted a long time. He was when he was at his best, that period of his career really lasted for a long time. What he did mostly was shoot. He was not a great defensive player. He hit threes, he stretched the defense, and he had those pump fakes, and he got a lot of foul shots out of off that pump fake, and so that those skills sustained even as his athleticism declined.
Yeah, he really, up until, even his last few seasons, he still was still a pretty strong player, still playing heavy minutes, still was, doing the same things that, he had been doing, his, he didn't quite have the same, as big a role toward the later part of his career, but really he, just was, and it honestly, it's a little bit surprising in retrospect. I think his reputation is almost bigger now than it was at the time, because he doesn't really have that many all NBA selections, 3 times in the third team, had 5 all-star selections, which is a good number, but not like I think the first time I kind of looked back, I'm like, oh wow, he didn't really I think he's almost like, his reputation is not better now exactly, but it's maybe even a little bigger now, because those famous playoff series, those clutch moments really loom large.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think there's also something to the length of his career sort of made him an icon for that franchise. I have the franchise index open on Basketball Reference, and I just counted, and he led the Pacers in win shares for 14 consecutive seasons. So, a decade and a half, he was the best player on that team. And, to spend his entire career with one franchise is really rare, and to sort of be the best player and the most dominant player on a franchise for so long is really rare. And so I think that helps build his legacy too. Even to this day, when you think of the Pacers, you think of Reggie Miller first. And so I think that elevates his legacy as well.
Mm-hmm. So Rich, who couldn't be with us tonight, has some deeper stats that he compiled, sort of some of his rankings to the players of his era who are also guards. He is 28th in points per 36, 29th in three-pointers per 36, 4th in effective field goal percentage, 3rd in value over replacement player behind Jordan and Stockton, and 8th in win shares per 48. Looking at among his position among guards all time, 77th in points per 36, 41st in three-point percentage, 10th in effective field goal percentage, 7th in value over replacement player, very good, obviously, and 18th in win shares per 48. I don't know. What do you think is the effect of being in the shadow of Jordan, and maybe that shadow being greater because he played in the same conference, a similar position, and fought each other a few times in the playoffs? So the Pacers were among the more effective teams in getting to the Bulls. They came probably the closest to any of those teams in those 6 years.
It's the same problem that, plagues Malone and Stockton and Barkley and a lot of other people's, that their primes ran up against Jordan. And, he's sort of an impossible standard to be measured against, because nobody in that era was as good as him. And he casts a long shadow over everyone. So, I think some of it is the bad luck of having run up against, Jordan. But that wasn't the, Jordan was not always the one who knocked the Pacers out. They had some chances other seasons. That Malice in the Palace season, that felt like a really special Pacers season. I think that was his second to last before he retired. And that looked like a team that could have competed for a title. And everything sort of fell apart around him, through no fault of his own there. And they had some other tough playoff losses, and the one time they made the finals, same kind of thing. They ran up against Shaq and Kobe, who were sort of at their peak, and they were, hopelessly overmatched there. So, it's one of those things who, he had a very, very great career, and it looks not quite as great when you hold it up against some of the other contemporaries who were even better.
Yeah. Curtis Harris talks about Walt Bellamy and Nate Thurmond, getting stuck behind, Russell and Chamberlain and later Kareem. They kind of that same phenomenon. These guys are we're really, really good, but they're stuck on, but they're just not as well regarded because, you're behind, you just get behind a historical great or two right around the same time you're playing. It's really hard to overcome that, even though, Reggie Miller is a well-remembered player. He certainly is someone who, people, who stands out. I guess a lot of that's the personality, like you talked about. I mean, he was a great villain. He was, and a great character.
Yeah, and it's funny to hear him called a great villain, because I was a Pacers fan, so I thought of everybody else as the villains. The Knicks were the villains, and he was the hero. He was the brash, cocky hero. But yeah, I think his legacy and sort of where he stands on this list is about his personality and about his aesthetic and about the visceral experience of watching him play. Of as a fan, as somebody who watched the Pacers regularly, that feeling that it was never hopeless, you were never completely out of a game. If there was 2 seconds left, that feeling that he could hit that shot, that he could make it. I also think it's kind of sad, but I would imagine that his legacy has been tarnished somewhat by his work as an announcer. I know he is not everyone's favorite guy to listen to call a game. So maybe if he had become an insurance salesman or something after the game, we might be talking about him a little differently.
Maybe. So I have a question. Let's say you're down to number 50, and taking personal bias aside, and Reggie Miller and Ray Allen are your last two. Who do you think you choose?
Oh, man. Personal bias, I would take Reggie. I think probably Allen was a more complete player. I think he was a much better athlete than Reggie Miller ever was. There's also, hold Ray Allen up to anybody else, and he seems like a specialist. But compared to Reggie, I think he was a much more diverse scorer, especially when he was younger. He sort of did a lot of things that maybe Reggie couldn't do. But I also don't feel like. I also don't think Ray Allen ever maybe inspired the same kind of fear that Reggie did, or that same sort of sense of hope for the fans or hopelessness for the opposing fans. I don't know. Other than that Spurs game, if Ray Allen's a guy who breaks your heart as much as Reggie does. So I guess in a vacuum I'd have to say Allen, but I don't know if I could ever totally remove emotion from it.
Well, yeah, their cases are strikingly similar, which I guess isn't a huge surprise, but because they did have similar styles. But really, I completely agree with you. I mean, I really, and I might even think about Reggie, and I think that really that like having that burden on your shoulder of being like having to be the guy on the team. He had well-rounded teams, he had good teammates, but having to do that, which Allen didn't really ever have to do to the same extent. I mean, he was on some good teams as well, but obviously, he's part of a big three in the Celtics. Like, he didn't have to be the man in the same way that Reggie did, and so, and numbers wise, their cases are pretty similar. They have similar length careers and similar, across the board, their numbers are actually even more similar than I realized they would be. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I kind of view Reggie as a possibility, but it will take some work to obviously kind of dig through. I do think the way that he rates among the level of guys for his era is certainly strong, and really for all time. I mean, he really is a being a great shooter, being one of the greatest shooters in NBA history is certainly helpful, and that's incredibly valuable. I mean, I wonder if I'm guessing he probably would have even be better in this NBA as opposed to when he played.
Yeah, and I know that's one of the things that we talked about the other time about measuring these guys with statistics. That there's some that it's hard to compare guys across eras because the game changed from period to period, and that often guys maybe get a little special consideration if they were sort of a pioneer in something, if they were sort of the first one to use a certain advantage or play a certain way. And, the three-point line had been around for, a decade before Reggie came in the league, and there were certainly other players who took advantage of it as well, especially in his era. There were other great three-point shooters, Dale Ellis and, Del Curry and stuff like that. But Reggie seemed unique in that he was a great player and a great scorer who focused on the three-point line. And it seemed like most of the other great three-point shooters in his era were role players, were complementary players. And he's one of the first that I can think of who was sort of a star and carried his team's offense and did that from the three-point line. And so, there's something to be said for that, that was sort of a trailblazing technique or style.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that makes sense to me. Yeah, I mean, I really do think he is the first to kind of make that like a primary weapon and to make that an effective way to be an elite scorer, an elite player by using the 3-point line. You're right. Most of the guys were role players, and even someone like Bird, who certainly was a great 3-point shooter, didn't use it that often.
Yeah. Reggie's game was run off a screen, get a 3-point shot, and if you were off balance, he'd pump fake, drive past you, and get to the free throw line. Considering how much he's sort of viewed as a one-dimensional shooter, his free throw totals are actually, his free throw attempt totals are actually really pretty high and pretty remarkable. Hold him up against, somebody from today, like, Korver or something like that, which I think is how a lot of people think of him, Korver or Redick or somebody like that. He got to the free throw line a lot. And some of it was, questionable leg kicking and flailing, and he definitely was a flopper before his time. But, he had that part of his game, too.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say before we go?
I don't think so, but I don't let Reggie's announcing take away from the player that he was. Every time you watch him call a game, I would encourage you to shut off the sound, and then when the game's over, just fire up some clips on YouTube, and you'll see him for what he really is.
All right. Well, luckily, Rich is a pretty big Reggie fan, so you've got him in your corner as far as us doing this list, and I promise not to let the announcing influence me in any way. So.
All right, thanks a lot, Jason.
All right, Ian, thanks so much. And everyone, thanks for listening. We're going to continue looking at top 50 contenders in our everlasting search for a new top 50. So thanks, everyone, for checking us out. You can find us at hardwoodparoxysm.com, and we're also part of the HB Basketball Podcast Network. So, all right, until next time, see ya.